The old man stood in a cornfield somewhere in Iowa, his weathered hand trembling as it touched the fuselage of an airplane that should not be here. Paint peeled from metal that once bore no insignia, no weapons, no purpose beyond spreading chemicals across farmland under a summer sun. But this plane killed someone he loved, and this plane impossibly saved his life. His name was Robert Harrison. Friends called him Bob. He was 82 years old, and he had spent 56 of those years trying to understand how a machine designed to spray pesticide became the weapon that defined his entire existence. The camera pulled back. We saw the full aircraft now. An Air Tractor 802, squat and ungainly, its high wing configuration giving it the silhouette of something that belonged on a 1940s propaganda poster rather than a modern battlefield. There were no missiles visible today, no gun pods, no targeting systems, just bare metal and fading paint and the ghosts of 1,000 missions nobody would ever read about in history books. Bob Harrison turned to face the camera. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat matter of fact tone of a man who had looked death in the face so many times that fear became just another instrument reading to monitor and correct. "This is the plane that killed him," Bob said, "and this is the plane that saved me." Cut to black and white footage from 1969. Grainy film stock captured the moment a small aircraft, an OV-10 Bronco, spiraled toward jungle canopy in Southeast Asia. Smoke trailed from the engine. The camera mounted on another aircraft watched helplessly as the plane disappeared into green darkness. No explosion, no dramatic fireball, just the quiet disappearance of a life into the void. 56 years ago, Bob continued, his voice steady over the archival footage. "My brother died in a crop duster over Vietnam. Today, America just bought 75 more. And I need to tell you why that is the most important thing our military has done in half a century." The year was 2025. We were standing in the present, looking backward through decades of war and loss and slowly dawning understanding. But to comprehend why an 82-year-old veteran believed that buying crop dusters represented a turning point in American military history, we needed to go back. Back to when Bob Harrison was young. Back to when his brother Jim was still alive. Back to when the United States military first learned that sometimes the simplest weapon is the deadliest. Robert Harrison was born in 1943 in the heart of Iowa farm country, where the soil runs black and deep and the horizon stretches unbroken to the edge of the world. His older brother James, called Jim by everyone who knew him, arrived 2 years earlier in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor turned America's attention from plowshares to swords. They grew up in the shadow of World War II, playing war games in cornfields, while their father listened to radio broadcasts about victories in Europe and the Pacific. Both boys learned to fly before they learned to drive. Their father owned a small Piper Cub that he used for surveying the farm, and by age 14, Bob could handle the stick well enough to take off and land without making his mother pray quite so fervently. Jim, older and more confident, went solo at 12, lying about his age to a local instructor who knew better but respected the boy's natural talent too much to ask difficult questions. The brothers were different in temperament, but identical in their love of aviation. Jim was steady, methodical, the kind of pilot who checked everything twice and trusted his instruments over his instincts. Bob flew by feel, making corrections before the gauges told him they were needed, landing by the seat of his pants in crosswinds that would have grounded more cautious men. Their father used to joke that Jim would die of old age in a rocking chair, while Bob would die young, doing something stupid and spectacular. History proved him wrong on both counts. By 1965, both Harrison brothers had joined the Air Force. Jim, true to form, chose a path that seemed conservative and practical. He volunteered for forward air control, flying the OV-10 Bronco, a twin turboprop aircraft designed specifically for low and slow reconnaissance missions over hostile territory. The OV-10 was not glamorous. It carried no advanced avionics, no radar-guided missiles, no afterburners that could punch it past the speed of sound. It was, in the words of one pilot, a crop duster with guns. Bob Harrison chose differently. He wanted speed. He wanted power. He wanted the F-4 Phantom, that screaming twin-engine monster that could break Mach 2 and carry enough ordnance to level a city block. When Jim told his younger brother about his assignment to OV-10, Bob laughed. Not cruelly, but with the easy condescension of a younger sibling who believes he has figured out something his older brother missed. "You are going to die in that thing," Bob said over beers at a bar near Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, 3 months before Jim shipped out to Vietnam. "It is slow, it is vulnerable, it is a flying coffin." Jim Harrison sipped his beer and smiled the patient smile of someone who knows something you do not yet understand. "Maybe," Jim said, "but when some grunt is pinned down and screaming for air support, I will be overhead in 5 minutes. Your Phantom will still be on the runway waiting for clearance." Bob Harrison did not remember what he said next. He had tried over the decades to recall his exact words. But memory is selective. In some things, the mind protects itself from knowing. What he did remember with crystal clarity was the feeling, the certainty that his brother was making a mistake, the conviction that fancy airplanes won wars, not flying tractors. 3 months later, Jim Harrison was in Vietnam. Bob was still stateside going through advanced training. They wrote letters. Jim's were long, detailed, full of stories about missions where he flew so low he could see the expressions on enemy soldiers' faces. He wrote about calling in airstrikes that saved entire platoons. He wrote about landing on dirt roads to evacuate wounded men. He wrote about the OV-10, that ugly, slow, vulnerable plane, and how it saved more lives per flight hour than any fighter bomber in the Air Force inventory. Bob wrote back with stories of Mach 2 runs and afterburner tests and all the exciting things that real fighter pilots did. The last letter Jim Harrison ever wrote arrived at Bob's barracks on a Tuesday morning in June 1969. It was shorter than usual, just 2 pages. The handwriting, normally precise, wavered in places as though written in turbulence. "Bobby," the letter began. Jim was the only person who ever called him that. "These Broncos are just crop dusters with guns. Everyone says so. The fast movers call us sitting ducks. The bomber guys say we are wasting our time. But I need you to know something, little brother. In 18 months over here, I have called in strikes that saved 43 American soldiers. 43 men who got to go home to their families because I was overhead in my slow, stupid, vulnerable plane when they needed me." The letter continued. Jim talked about a mission where he spent 8 hours circling a Special Forces camp under siege directing artillery and gunship fire until relief arrived at dawn. He talked about landing on a highway to pick up a wounded Marine whose medevac helicopter could not reach him. He talked about the limitations of his plane and how those limitations paradoxically made him more effective than the fast movers who screamed past at 500 knots and saw nothing but targets. "The best weapon," Jim wrote in closing, "is not the one that kills the most enemy. It is the one that saves the most friends. Remember that, Bobby. When you get over here with your fancy Phantom, remember that." 2 weeks later, Jim Harrison's OV-10 Bronco took ground fire over a village in the Central Highlands. A single bullet fired from a Soviet-made AK-47 by a 19-year-old North Vietnamese soldier who could not see the airplane clearly through the jungle canopy punctured the fuel tank. The plane did not explode. It did not spiral dramatically to Earth. It simply lost power, descended below the tree line, and disappeared. Search and rescue found the wreckage 3 days later. Jim Harrison died on impact. He was 28 years old. Bob Harrison, still stateside, still training, received the news from a chaplain who had clearly delivered this message too many times to retain much capacity for genuine emotion. Bob did not cry, did not rage, did not fall apart. He simply nodded, thanked the chaplain, and walked out of the barracks into the Texas sun that suddenly seemed far too bright. That night, alone in his quarters, Bob Harrison made 2 decisions. First, he would volunteer for Vietnam, immediately pull whatever strings necessary to get deployed. Second, he would never ever fly a slow plane. His brother died because the OV-10 was vulnerable, because it was a crop duster with delusions of adequacy, because the Air Force in its wisdom sent good men into combat in flying tractors and called it strategy. Bob Harrison would fly the Phantom. He would fly fast and high and invulnerable. He would kill the enemy from altitudes where ground fire was nothing but mosquito bites against titanium skin. He would never, under any circumstances, put himself in the kind of danger that killed his brother. This decision would define the next 30 years of Bob's life, and it was completely, tragically, magnificently wrong. But that realization would not come for decades. First, there would be a brief deployment to Vietnam in late 1969, where Bob's F-4 Phantom flew a handful of missions before the drawdown began. The war ended before he could prove anything to himself or Jim's memory. Then there would be peace of a sort, and a long career in the peacetime Air Force, teaching young pilots the gospel of speed and altitude. Then there would be retirement in 2000 at age 57, with a chest full of medals and a quiet, gnawing certainty that something about his entire career had been fundamentally mistaken. And then in 2002, at age 59, Bob Harrison did something that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He volunteered for a secretive unit within Special Operations Command. The unit flew a plane called the U-28A Draco. And the U-28A Draco was in every meaningful sense a crop duster with guns. The U-28A started life as a Pilatus PC-12, a Swiss design and single-engine turboprop used primarily for corporate transport and air ambulance work. SOCOM took the basic airframe, added intelligence and surveillance equipment, installed hardpoints for weapons, and created a platform that could fly low and slow over hostile territory for extended periods. It was everything the OV-10 Bronco had been updated for the 21st century. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of plane that killed Bob Harrison's brother. Why did he volunteer? Bob has asked himself this question 10,000 times over the past 23 years. The easy answer is that he wanted to understand what Jim saw in these ugly, vulnerable, slow aircraft. The harder answer is that somewhere deep in his soul, beneath the layers of training and doctrine and carefully constructed self-image, Bob Harrison knew his brother was right. From 2002 to 2015, Bob flew the U-28A across Afghanistan and Iraq. He flew missions that lasted 8, 10, 12 hours, circling over remote valleys and desert highways, providing reconnaissance and fire support for Special Forces teams who operated far beyond the reach of normal air cover. He learned what Jim had known in 1969. That speed is useless if you cannot stay on station. That altitude is meaningless if you cannot see the faces of the men you are protecting. That the most advanced weapons in the world are worthless if they are not overhead when needed. On a night in 2008, Bob Harrison landed his U-28A on a dirt road in eastern Afghanistan in total darkness under enemy fire to evacuate 6 Navy SEALs whose helicopter had been shot down. An F-16 could not have done this. An F-22 could not have done this. A B-2 bomber with all its stealth technology and billion-dollar price tag could not have done this. Only the crop duster could do this. One of those 6 SEALs was a young captain named Marcus Webb. 17 years later, in the spring of 2024, General Marcus Webb would knock on the door of Bob Harrison's farmhouse in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and ask the 81-year-old veteran to help him convince America to buy 75 crop dusters. But that is getting ahead of the story. First, we need to understand what happened between 2015, when Bob retired for the second and supposedly final time, in 2024, when the past came calling in the form of a man whose life Bob saved in the darkness over Afghanistan. Bob Harrison spent those 9 years in quiet obscurity. He bought a small farm outside Cedar Rapids, the same area where he and Jim grew up. He did not plant corn or soybeans. Instead, he leased the land to younger farmers and spent his days restoring vintage aircraft. Piper Cubs, mostly. The same kind of plane his father flew. Simple machines from a simpler time when flying was about stick and rudder and the feel of wind over wings. He did not speak much about his service. Not about Vietnam, which ended before he could fly more than a dozen missions. Not about the years teaching at Nellis Air Force Base. And especially not about the 13 years flying the U-28A, which remained largely classified and would for decades to come. His neighbors knew he was a veteran. They knew he could fly. But they did not know about the missions, the close calls, the nights when Bob Harrison kept entire Special Forces teams alive by the simple act of remaining overhead when faster, fancier aircraft had to leave for fuel. Bob lived alone. He had married once in the 1970s, but that ended quietly and without much drama after 5 childless years. He dated occasionally, but never seriously. He had friends in the veteran community, men and women, who understood certain things without them needing to be spoken. And he had always the memory of Jim, the brother who chose the slow plane and died for it, the brother whose judgment Bob spent 50 years questioning, even as he proved that judgment correct with every mission he flew. On a Tuesday morning in May 2024, Bob Harrison was in his workshop replacing the fabric on a Piper Cub's wing when he heard a car pull up the gravel drive. He did not get many visitors. The UPS driver knew to leave packages on the porch. The few friends who might drop by unannounced would have called first out of rural courtesy. Bob wiped his hands on a rag and walked out into the morning sun. A black SUV sat in his driveway, dust still settling around its wheels. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, fit, mid-50s, wearing civilian clothes that did not quite hide the bearing of someone who'd spent a career giving orders and expecting them to be followed. It took Bob 3 seconds to place the face. Older now, grayer but unmistakable. The last time Bob Harrison saw Marcus Webb, the man was 39 years old and bleeding from shrapnel wounds, being loaded into a U-28A's cabin at 3 in the morning on a dirt road in Afghanistan. Boss, Marcus said, extending his hand. I need you one more time. Bob shook the offered hand. Marcus Webb's grip was still firm, still confident. The handshake of a man accustomed to authority. I am 81 years old, Marcus, Bob said. My flying days are over. Marcus Webb smiled. It was not a happy expression. I do not need you to fly, the general said. I need you to convince the American people that we are not crazy. They went inside. Bob made coffee, strong and black, the way soldiers drink it. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Bob's mother once served dinner to two boys who dreamed of flying, and Marcus Webb explained why he was here. The United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, had just awarded a contract for 75 aircraft. These were not F-35 Lightning stealth fighters, each costing over $100 million. They were not advanced drones, not hypersonic bombers, not anything that belonged in a Tom Clancy novel. They were, in the words of one senator who opposed the program, flying tractors. Marcus opened his laptop and turned it so Bob could see the screen. The image showed an aircraft in flight, its high wing and pusher propeller configuration instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent time around agricultural aviation. An air tractor 802 modified for military use, bristling with sensors and weapons hardpoints. The military designation was Sky Warden. Bob stared at the screen. He felt something cold settling in his chest, spreading outward like frost on glass. That airplane looked almost identical to the OV-10 Bronco. The same ungainly profile, the same crop duster DNA, the same design philosophy that got Jim Harrison killed in 1969. You want me, Bob said slowly, to sell the American people on the same kind of plane that killed my brother. Marcus Webb closed the laptop. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 16 years in command, of decisions made in darkness, of men sent into harm's way on orders he gave. Do you remember Afghanistan, Bob, 2008? That dirt road where you landed to pick us up? Bob remembered. He would remember that night until the day he died. You were flying a U-28A, Marcus continued. Also a crop duster, basically. And you landed that plane in total darkness with Taliban fighters 300 meters away because a helicopter could not reach us and an F-16 could not land. You saved 6 lives that night because you were flying the right plane. Not the fastest, not the most expensive. The right one. Jim died flying the right plane, Bob said quietly. Jim saved 43 men flying the right plane, Marcus countered. I checked the records. 43 confirmed saves in 18 months of combat. That is not dying in vain, Bob. That is legacy. They talked for 2 hours. Marcus explained the program, the costs, the capabilities, the dire strategic necessity. America had been fighting for years in places most Americans could not find on a map. Small wars in African nations, counterterrorism operations, hostage rescues, support for allied forces against insurgencies that threatened to destabilize entire regions. These were not wars where F-35s and B-2 bombers made sense. These were wars where you needed aircraft that could stay overhead for 8 hours, land on dirt roads, and cost $8,000 per flight hour instead of $80,000. The Sky Warden, Marcus explained, was the culmination of decades of lessons learned. It had the endurance of the U-28A, the weapons capacity of the OV-10, and modern avionics that gave it capabilities Jim Harrison never dreamed of. Laser designators, infrared imaging, missile warning systems, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks. Everything that might have saved Jim's life combined with the operational philosophy that made his sacrifice meaningful. But there was a problem. Congress was balking. Senator Catherine Torres, chairwoman of the Armed Services Committee, was leading the opposition. She saw the Sky Warden as wasteful spending, as nostalgia for a bygone era, as putting pilots in flying coffins, when drones could do the job without risk to human life. The program had 6 months to prove itself, or $3 billion in development costs would be wasted and the capability lost forever. Why me? Bob asked finally. I am nobody, retired, no influence. You are a veteran who flew both kinds of missions, Marcus said. The fast jets and the slow planes. You lost a brother to a crop duster and then spent 13 years proving those crop dusters work. And the lead test pilot for Sky Warden. His name is Jack Reeves. His grandfather flew OV-10s with your brother in Vietnam. The cold in Bob's chest spread. Tom Reeves. He remembered that name. Jim's wingman. Another crop duster pilot. Another man who died flying slow over hostile territory. Tom died 2 weeks after Jim, Bob said. Yes, Marcus confirmed. And Jack Reeves has been asking the same questions you have. Whether his grandfather died a hero or a fool. Whether crop dusters or weapons or coffins. I think you two need to meet. I think you need to see this plane fly. And then I need you to tell the story. Your story, Jim's story. Why simple planes flown by brave men are more valuable than all the stealth technology in the world. Bob Harrison sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the Iowa wind moved through budding cornfields. Somewhere in the distance, a crop duster droned across the sky, doing the work these planes were designed for before war repurposed them into instruments of salvation and death. If you are watching this video and you served in Vietnam, you understand what comes next. You remember the debates about which planes mattered, which missions counted, which men deserved to be called heroes. Bob Harrison remembered too. He remembered laughing at his brother's choice. He remembered thinking crop dusters were for fools. He remembered 50 years of guilt and slowly dawning understanding that maybe, just maybe, Jim knew something Bob did not. I will come, Bob said finally. I will see the plane. I will meet this Jack Reeves. But I am not making any promises about selling anything to anybody. Clear, clear, Marcus said. They finished their coffee in silence, two old soldiers united by missions past and the knowledge that some debts can never truly be repaid, only honored in the carrying forward. And so it was that on a morning in June 2024, Bob Harrison drove to the airport and boarded a military transport bound for Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where he would see for the first time the airplane that represented both his greatest fear and his brother's vindication. He did not know then that this trip would change how he understood not just his brother's death, but the entire arc of his own life. He did not know that he was about to meet people whose losses mirrored his own, whose questions echoed across generations. He did not know that in 6 months he would deploy to Africa as an 81-year-old observer, watching crop dusters save thousands of lives in ways that billion-dollar stealth bombers never could. All Bob Harrison knew sitting in that transport with the engines thrumming and the future uncertain was that after 56 years of running from his brother's memory, he was finally terrifyingly flying toward it. Eglin Air Force Base sits on the Florida Panhandle where the Gulf of Mexico meets white sand beaches and pine forests that stretch inland toward Alabama. It is one of the largest air bases in the world, covering over 700 square miles of restricted airspace where the United States military tests weapons systems that will not be declassified for decades. Bob Harrison had been here before many years ago, when the F-4 Phantom was still the premier fighter in the American arsenal. The base looked different now, larger, more crowded with aircraft he did not recognize. The transport landed at 1400 hours on a June afternoon, when the temperature hovered near 90 degrees and the humidity made breathing feel like drowning. Bob descended the ramp into a wall of heat that struck him like a physical blow. He was not as young as he used to be. 81 years meant the body complained about things it once accepted without comment. A staff car waited on the tarmac. The driver, a young airman who looked about 12 years old to Bob's aged eyes, saluted crisply and opened the rear door. Bob returned the salute out of habit, climbed in, and let the blessed air conditioning wash over him, while the driver navigated through the base toward a section marked on signs as Restricted Area Alpha 7. They passed rows of parked aircraft, F-35s sleek and angular, looking more like spacecraft than airplanes. C-130 transports their high wings and propellers, a throwback to an earlier era. A-10 Warthogs, ugly and beloved the tank killers that had served with distinction since the 1970s. And then tucked away on a remote corner of the flight line, Bob saw them. Three aircraft painted in low-visibility gray sat on the concrete with ground crews swarming around them. Even from a distance, Bob recognized the silhouette. High wing, pusher propeller, the unmistakable profile of an agricultural aircraft transformed into something that belonged on a battlefield. Sky Warden. The car stopped beside a hangar where Marcus Webb waited in the shade. The general had changed into a flight suit, and for a moment Bob was transported back to Afghanistan, to that night in 2008 when Marcus was still a captain, still young enough to believe in immortality. "Bob," Marcus said, shaking hands again. "Thank you for coming. I want you to meet someone." A man approached from the hangar. Mid-50s, fit in the way that pilots stay fit because their lives depend on split-second reactions and sustained concentration. He wore a flight suit with a name tag that read Reeves and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had logged thousands of hours and survived situations that would have killed lesser aviators. "Bob Harrison," Marcus said formally. "This is Major Jack Reeves, lead test pilot for the Sky Warden program." Jack extended his hand. His grip was firm, his eyes direct. In those eyes, Bob saw something familiar, the look of a man carrying questions too large to answer alone. "Mr. Harrison," Jack said. His voice was younger than Bob expected, but it carried an undercurrent of something older. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "My grandfather talked about your brother every day until he died. He said Jim Harrison was the bravest pilot he ever knew." The words hit Bob like shrapnel. He had not heard anyone speak Jim's name with that kind of reverence in decades. Most people who remembered Vietnam were dead now, or too old to care, or had decided those memories were better left buried. "They both flew planes everyone called death traps," Bob said quietly. "And they saved lives every single flight," Jack replied. For a moment, neither man spoke. They stood in the Florida heat, two generations of loss connected by airplanes that should never have been weapons watching, ground crews prepare machines that history kept trying to retire, and necessity kept resurrecting. Marcus cleared his throat. "Jack is going to take you up, show you what Sky Warden can do. Elena is already aboard running pre-flight diagnostics." "Elena?" Bob asked. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," Marcus said. "Lead engineer from L3 Harris, the company that builds these birds. She insisted on being here when you arrived." They walked across the tarmac toward the nearest Sky Warden. Up close, the utilitarian design became even more apparent. Every line prioritized function. No wasted metal, no aesthetic compromises. This was a tool, not a trophy. But bolted onto this agricultural platform were the instruments of modern warfare. Hardpoints under the wings carried training versions of Hellfire missiles and rocket pods. A sensor turret protruded from the nose housing infrared cameras and laser designators. The cockpit glass was thicker than standard armored against small arms fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant flight controls, Kevlar plating around critical systems. Everything that might have saved Jim Harrison's life retrofitted onto a platform that shared his OV-10's fundamental design philosophy. A woman emerged from the cockpit, early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing coveralls marked with the L3 Harris logo. She climbed down the boarding ladder with the ease of someone who spent more time around aircraft than in offices. "Mr. Harrison," she said, extending an oil-stained hand. "Elena Vasquez. I have been waiting to meet you." Bob shook her hand. "Dr. Vasquez." "Just Elena, please. My father would have appreciated the formality, but I prefer to keep things simple." There was something in the way she said father, past tense, the same careful neutrality Bob used when speaking of Jim. "Your father was military?" Bob asked. Elena shook her head. "Crop duster pilot. Texas. He died when his plane crashed during a spray run in 1999. I was 7 years old." The connection snapped into place with almost physical force. Three people standing on a tarmac in Florida, united by aircraft that looked like farm equipment. Bob lost a brother to a crop duster. Jack lost a grandfather to a crop duster. Elena lost a father to a crop duster. And now they were all here trying to prove that the machines that took their families could save thousands of strangers. "I am sorry," Bob said, because there was nothing else to say that would not sound empty. Elena smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "I designed a Sky Warden because I wanted to prove that the kind of plane that killed my dad could save lives instead of just taking them. These aircraft are simple, rugged, reliable. The same qualities that made them good at spreading chemicals make them perfect for staying over a battlefield for 8 hours when fancy jets have to leave for fuel. She gestured toward the Sky Warden. I put everything I know about agricultural aviation into this design, and I need to know if it is good enough. If my father's plane would have been proud of its descendant. Bob looked at the aircraft, then at Elena, then at Jack. 3 generations tied together by losses that made no sense, and a machine that somehow represented redemption for all of them. Let us fly, Bob said. The cockpit of the Sky Warden held 2 seats in tandem configuration. Jack took the front seat, pilot in command. Bob climbed into the rear seat, which was configured for a sensor operator or weapons system officer. Elena stayed on the ground monitoring systems remotely from a laptop she balanced on a maintenance cart. Jack ran through pre-flight checks with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. His hands moved across switches and displays with practiced ease, calling out checklist items in the rhythmic cadence that pilots use to impose order on the controlled chaos of aviation. Bob strapped in. The seat was surprisingly comfortable, far more so than the Spartan accommodations of the U-28A he had flown in Afghanistan. The canopy provided excellent visibility in all directions. The instruments were modern glass displays, instead of the analog gauges Bob grew up with, but their purpose was universal. Airspeed, altitude, heading, fuel. The eternal concerns of anyone who chooses to leave the Earth. Ready back there, sir. Jack's voice came through the intercom clear, despite the engine noise. Ready, Bob confirmed, and felt his hands start to tremble. He had not been in a small aircraft in 9 years. Since retiring in 2015, he had avoided situations that might trigger the memories that lurked just below the surface of consciousness. The smell of aviation fuel, the vibration of a turbine engine, the way light filtered through a canopy at altitude. All of these could bring back Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, by proxy, and the particular variety of terror that comes from flying low and slow over people who want to kill you. The engine note changed as Jack advanced the throttle. Sky Warden rolled forward, taxiing toward the runway, with the ground crews waving them past. Bob's hands gripped the armrests, his heart rate elevated. The classic signs of an anxiety response, which he recognized clinically even as his body ignored reason and prepared for threat. They turned onto the runway. Jack brought the throttle to full power. The acceleration was smooth, but not dramatic. This was not an F-4 Phantom that could slam you back in your seat with brutal force. This was a crop duster designed to fly steadily and efficiently, not to win races. The wheels left the ground. Bob felt the familiar sensation of flight that moment, when the aircraft transitions from being a vehicle that rolls on wheels to one that swims through air. They climbed over the Gulf of Mexico, turning south toward restricted airspace where Jack could demonstrate capabilities without civilian aircraft getting nervous. At 2,000 feet, Jack leveled off and reduced power to cruise settings. The cockpit quieted. Through the canopy, Bob could see the Florida coastline stretching east and west, white beaches meeting blue-green water under a sky so clear it hurt to look at directly. First thing you need to know, Jack said over the intercom, is endurance. We took off with full fuel 30 minutes ago. We can stay airborne for another 7.5 hours. No refueling, no returning to base. Just continuous presence over whatever piece of ground needs watching. He banked the aircraft, gently demonstrating handling characteristics. She flies like a dream, stable, responsive. You can hand fly her for hours without getting tired, and if someone shoots at us, Jack pressed a button. Flares deployed from dispensers under the wings bright points of heat that would decoy infrared-guided missiles. We have countermeasures, missile warning systems, armor plating around the cockpit and engine, self-sealing fuel tanks. Everything your brother's OV-10 did not have. Bob said nothing. His throat had tightened. Memories were flooding back. Not of his own flights in the U-28A, but older memories. Second-hand memories constructed from Jim's letters, from accident reports Bob had obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, from his own imagination, trying to reconstruct the last moments of his brother's life. Jim's OV-10 had no missile warning system, no armor, no countermeasures, just aluminum skin and the pilot's vigilance against threats that came without warning from jungles below. A single bullet in the fuel tank, a slow leak, decreasing power, the engine coughing. Jim would have tried to maintain altitude to reach friendly territory, but the numbers are unforgiving. Fuel feeds, engine feeds, power feeds, altitude. Take away the fuel and gravity becomes an enemy no amount of skill can defeat. Mr. Harrison, Jack's voice carried concern. Sir, are you okay? Bob realized his breathing had become rapid and shallow. Classic hyperventilation. He forced himself to slow down, to breathe deeply, to ground himself in the present rather than the past. I am fine, Bob lied. Just been a while. Jack did not press the issue. He continued the demonstration, showing how Sky Warden could loiter at low altitude, how the sensor package could track targets day or night, how the weapon systems integrated with modern precision munitions to deliver firepower with minimal collateral damage. He flew low over the water down to 200 feet where Bob could see individual waves and feel the way ground effect cushioned the aircraft's flight. At this altitude in this airplane, Bob Harrison was flying exactly the kind of mission that killed his brother. Low, slow, vulnerable. And yet he was still alive. The aircraft hummed around him, stable and confident, doing what crop dusters had always done best. Staying airborne for hours, covering ground methodically, being present when presence mattered. They flew for 90 minutes. By the time Jack turned back toward Eglin, Bob's trembling had stopped. Something had shifted inside him. Some knot of tension that had been tied for 56 years, just beginning to loosen. They landed smoothly. Jack taxied back to the hangar where Elena waited with her laptop and an expression that managed to combine professional satisfaction with personal vulnerability. All systems performed within specifications, she announced as they climbed out. How did she feel? Jack looked at Bob, deferring the question to the passenger. Bob stood on the tarmac, feeling the heat rise from concrete, looking at this ungainly aircraft that should not exist and certainly should not work as well as it did. He thought about Jim, about Tom Reeves, about Elena's father spreading chemicals over Texas farmland, about all the men who flew slow when the doctrine demanded fast, who stayed low when the manual said high, who chose vulnerability in service of effectiveness. It felt, Bob said slowly, like something my brother would have loved. Elena's expression transformed. For a moment, she looked like she might cry. Then she took a breath and became professional again. Good, because we have a problem, and I need both of you to help solve it. They moved into the hangar, out of the heat, into the relative cool of concrete and metal, and the smell of hydraulic fluid. Elena opened her laptop on a workbench and pulled up a series of documents. The Sky Warden program has enemies, she said without preamble. Powerful enemies. Senator Catherine Torres is leading the opposition. She chairs the Armed Services Committee. She thinks we are wasting $3 billion on obsolete technology. She has been giving interviews to every media outlet that will listen, calling Sky Warden a flying coffin, saying we are going to get pilots killed. Jack crossed his arms. Torres does not understand asymmetric warfare. She still thinks the only threats that matter are peer adversaries with advanced air defenses. She does not care about the 23 countries where we are actually fighting. It is more than that, Elena said. Torres is personal about this. Her father was a B-52 pilot in Vietnam. He believed in overwhelming firepower, big bombs, high altitude. She inherited that worldview. She genuinely thinks that slow aircraft are suicide machines. Bob felt something click into place. Torres, California. What was her father's first name? Elena checked her notes. Miguel Torres. He flew a full tour in Vietnam, survived, retired as a colonel in 1985. Bob sat down heavily on a nearby stool. The universe was smaller than anyone wanted to believe, folding back on itself in ways that would seem contrived in fiction, but happen constantly in the tight-knit community of military aviation. June 12, 1969, Bob said quietly. A B-52 on a strike mission over Laos. An OV-10 pilot spotted a SAM site that the bomber's radar missed, called off the strike, saved the entire crew. That pilot was my brother. The B-52 pilot he saved was Miguel Torres. Silence fell over the hangar. Elena stared at her laptop. Jack looked at Bob with something like awe. Marcus Webb, who had been listening from the hangar entrance, walked over slowly. You are certain? Marcus asked. I read Jim's after-action reports 1,000 times, Bob said. After he died, I obtained every document I could find. That mission was one of his last. He got a Distinguished Flying Cross for it. The citation mentioned saving a B-52 crew. I never knew the names, they were classified. But it was June 12th, 1969, 2 weeks before Jim died. Marcus pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke briefly in the clipped language of someone giving orders. When he hung up, his expression was grim. I'm going to confirm this through official channels, he said. If it checks out, this changes everything. Senator Torres is trying to kill a program that is built on the legacy of a man who saved her father's life. She just does not know it yet. Why would you hide that from her? Bob asked. Because if we tell her now, she will think we are manipulating her, Marcus said. This has to come out naturally, in testimony, on record, where she cannot dismiss it as a political ploy. Elena closed her laptop. We have 6 months to prove Sky Warden works. Congress convenes hearings in July. If we cannot demonstrate operational success by then, Torres will have the votes to cancel the program. Then we demonstrate success, Jack said simply. Bob looked at the three of them. Marcus the general who bet his career on crop dusters. Jack the pilot trying to prove his grandfather died a hero. Elena the engineer who turned grief into aeronautical achievement. And himself an old man who spent 50 years running from his brother's choice only to discover that choice was vindicated by history. What do you need from me? Bob asked. Marcus smiled. Come to the hearings. Testify. Tell them what you just told us. Let Congress know that the program they want to kill exists because men like your brother proved with their lives that sometimes the simple weapon is the right weapon. Before Bob could answer, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression changed. Not fear exactly, but concern shading into alarm. We have a situation, she said, turning the phone so they could all see. A news alert scrolled across the screen. CNN breaking news. Senator Catherine Torres announces emergency hearings on Sky Warden program. Questions raised about safety and strategic value. Vote scheduled for August. They moved up the timeline, Marcus said. We do not have 6 months. We have 6 weeks. If you served in the military during any era, you understand what this moment feels like. The sudden compression of time. The realization that plans made carefully must now be executed hastily. The knowledge that mistakes made in haste can have consequences that echo for decades. Bob Harrison understood this perfectly. He had lived through it in Vietnam and Afghanistan, in a dozen crises where time became the enemy and decisions had to be made with incomplete information and no guarantee of success. Then we have 6 weeks, Bob said. What is the plan? Marcus looked at Jack, then at Elena, then back at Bob. The plan is to deploy. Take Sky Warden to Africa. Run operational missions. Prove that this aircraft can do things that no billion-dollar stealth fighter can do. And hope that reality is more convincing than politics. Elena shook her head. You cannot deploy Bob. He is 81 years old. The insurance alone would be... I am not asking for permission, Bob interrupted. Jim died proving these aircraft work. I am not going to let his legacy die because some senator is too proud to admit her father survived because of a crop duster pilot. If Sky Warden deploys, I deploy. As an observer. As whatever title keeps the lawyers happy. But I am going. Jack grinned. It was the first genuine smile Bob had seen from the younger pilot. My grandfather would have liked you, Mr. Harrison. Call me Bob, and your grandfather and my brother would have liked Sky Warden, so let us make damn sure it succeeds. They stood in the hangar while the Florida sun beat down outside and the future compressed from months into weeks. 3 aircraft sat on the flight line, gray and ungainly, looking like they belonged over cornfields rather than battlefields. But appearances, as Bob Harrison was learning after 8 decades of life, meant nothing. Purpose was what mattered. Effectiveness was what counted. And sometimes the plane that looked like a flying tractor turned out to be the weapon that changed everything. What none of them knew standing in that hangar making plans was that Senator Catherine Torres was at that moment in Washington preparing testimony that would attack not just Sky Warden, but the entire philosophy it represented. That she was calling witnesses who would argue passionately and with data to support them that unmanned drones made aircraft like Sky Warden obsolete. That she genuinely believed, with the certainty of someone whose worldview was shaped by a father's narrow escape from death, that putting pilots in slow aircraft was tantamount to murder. And what Senator Torres did not know, could not know until the moment it was revealed to her in front of cameras and congressional colleagues and the watching world, was that the pilot she was about to condemn as reckless and obsolete was the same pilot who saved her father's life 54 years ago. But that revelation was still weeks away. First, there would be preparation, training, the bureaucratic nightmare of deploying 3 experimental aircraft to a combat zone. And Bob Harrison, 81 years old and tired, in ways that had nothing to do with age, would have to decide if he was ready to return to the kind of war his brother never came home from. He looked at Sky Warden one more time before leaving the hangar, studied its lines, memorized its proportions. This was Jim's plane, not literally but spiritually. The descendant, the evolution, the proof that his brother's judgment, mocked and dismissed, had been correct all along. "I am ready." "Already," Bob said to no one in particular, and to everyone who mattered. And so the pieces moved into position for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of 75 aircraft, but the question that had haunted Bob Harrison for more than half a century. Were the men who flew crop dusters into combat heroes or fools? Did simple weapons flown by brave pilots have a place in modern warfare? And could an old man finally make peace with a brother's death by proving that death meant something? The answers waited in Africa, in Senate hearing rooms, in the memories of men long dead and the choices of men still living. But first, Bob Harrison had to go home and pack. The flight back to Iowa gave Bob Harrison time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. At 81, he had learned that thinking too much about the past led nowhere useful. The past was fixed, immutable, a photograph that could be examined but never altered. And yet he could not stop his mind from returning to Jim, to those final letters, to the decisions made by a 26-year-old who thought he knew better than his older brother. His farmhouse felt emptier than usual when he returned. The restoration projects in his workshop seemed suddenly frivolous toys for an old man with too much time and not enough purpose. He spent 3 days putting his affairs in order, updating his will, writing letters to the few people who might care if he did not come back from wherever this was leading. The letters felt melodramatic as he wrote them, but experience taught that melodrama was just unexecuted caution, and caution kept you alive when younger men died around you. On the 4th day, Marcus Webb called. The Senate hearing was scheduled for July 15th, 3 weeks away. Bob would testify. His presence was requested but not required, Marcus said, which meant it was absolutely required, but they were being polite about it. Bob agreed without hesitation. He had made his decision in that Florida hangar. Everything afterward was just logistics. He flew to Washington 2 days early. The city in July was a special kind of hell heat and humidity, combining with the political atmosphere to create something oppressive and inescapable. His hotel was near Capitol Hill, close enough that he could walk to the Senate building if his knees cooperated, which they did not always do anymore. The night before the hearing, Bob could not sleep. He lay in the hotel bed watching headlights sweep across the ceiling, trying to organize thoughts that refused to stay organized. What would he say? How could he make a room full of politicians understand that some truths were written in blood and could not be reduced to budget line items? At 0300 hours, he gave up on sleep and turned on the television. CNN was running a segment on the hearing. Senator Torres appeared on screen, her face composed and certain, the expression of someone who knew exactly where they stood on every issue. "These Sky Warden aircraft represent everything wrong with Pentagon procurement," Torres said to the interviewer. "We are buying obsolete technology because we are romantic about the past. My father flew in Vietnam. He saw what happened to pilots in slow aircraft. They died. Simple as that. And I will not authorize spending $3 billion to kill more pilots just because some general has nostalgia for World War II." The interviewer asked about operational requirements, about asymmetric warfare, about all the careful arguments Marcus and his staff had prepared. Torres dismissed them with practiced ease. She had talking points, and she used them like weapons, sharp and effective. Bob turned off the television. He understood what he was up against now. Not malice, not stupidity, but certainty. Senator Torres was certain she was right, and certainty was harder to defeat than any argument, because certainty did not need evidence. It was self-sustaining. He must have dozed eventually because he woke to his phone alarm at 600, showered, dressed in the one suit he owned, a dark gray thing bought for funerals and worn to too many of them. Checked his appearance in the mirror and saw an old man staring back, weathered and tired, and carrying questions he could not answer alone. The Dirksen Senate office building was uglier than Bob remembered, a monument to 1950s architecture that prioritized function over beauty and achieved neither particularly well. security checkpoints, metal detectors. The theatrical performance of protection that made everyone feel safer without actually increasing safety. Bob moved through it with the patience of someone who had learned that complaining about security procedures accomplished nothing except marking you as a complainer. The hearing room was already filling when he arrived. Marcus Webb sat at a table reserved for military witnesses, flanked by Jack Reeves in dress uniform and Elena Vasquez in a conservative business suit that looked uncomfortable on someone more accustomed to coveralls. They nodded to Bob as he took a seat in the gallery reserved for invited guests. Senator Catherine Torres entered at exactly 900, followed by her staff and the other committee members. She was shorter than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature. This was her domain, her rules, her questions. The hearing began with procedural formalities. Roll call, opening statements, the careful dance of democratic theater where everyone knew their roles and performed them with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Torres gave the opening statement for the opposition, and it was devastating in its clarity. We are here today to discuss the Sky Warden program. She began, her voice carrying easily in the acoustics designed to amplify senatorial authority. A program that proposes to spend $3 billion buying 75 aircraft that are fundamentally crop dusters with weapons attached. The proponents will tell you these aircraft fill a vital role, that they provide capabilities no other platform can match. But I want this committee to remember one simple fact. In Vietnam, we lost hundreds of pilots flying slow aircraft over hostile territory. Hundreds of men who died because their planes could not outrun ground fire, could not survive hits, could not escape when the mission went wrong. She paused, letting the number sink in. Hundreds, not dozens. Hundreds of men in slow aircraft who never came home. My father was one of the lucky ones, Torres continued. He flew B-52s, high altitude, fast, protected by distance from ground fire. He survived his tour, he came home. And he told me every day of my childhood how he watched the slow planes get shot down, the A-1 Sky Raiders, the OV-10 Broncos, the forward air controllers who flew low and slow and died in numbers that would horrify anyone who examines the casualty statistics. Her voice hardened. And now we want to do it again. Build more slow planes, put more pilots in harm's way. Spend $3 billion to recreate the exact conditions that killed so many men in Vietnam. I cannot support this. I will not support this. And I believe this committee, when presented with the facts, will vote to terminate the Sky Warden program. She sat down. The silence that followed felt heavy, weighted with the names of dead pilots who could not testify in their own defense. Marcus Webb was called first to present the military's case. He spoke about operational requirements about the 23 countries where SOCOM was currently engaged, about the need for aircraft that could loiter for 8 hours over remote battlefields where no other air support was available. He presented data on cost per flight hour, on mission success rates, on the fundamental difference between Vietnam-era technology and modern defensive systems. It was a good presentation, competent, professional, utterly unconvincing to anyone who did not already agree with him. Senator Torres began her questions with surgical precision. General Webb, how many Sky Warden aircraft have been shot down in testing? None, Senator, but we have not yet deployed to hostile environments. How many will be shot down when you do deploy? That is impossible to predict with certainty, but you acknowledge they will be vulnerable to ground fire. All aircraft are vulnerable to some degree. Sky Warden has countermeasures armor-redundant systems. The OV-10 Bronco had countermeasures too, General, and we lost 48 of them in Vietnam, 48 aircraft, hundreds of crew members dead or captured. At what point do we learn from history instead of repeating it? Marcus had no good answer to that. No one did. The casualties were a matter of record. The only question was whether those casualties had been worthwhile, and that was a moral judgment no amount of data could settle. Jack Reeves testified next. He spoke about flying Sky Warden, about its handling characteristics, about the confidence he felt in the aircraft's ability to survive and complete missions. He was earnest and honest and young enough that his passion showed through the military formality. Torres destroyed him gently. Major Reeves, your grandfather flew OV-10s in Vietnam. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. and he was killed in action, shot down over Laos. Yes, ma'am. So you are asking this committee to approve an aircraft similar to the one that killed your grandfather. Do you not see the irony? Jack's jaw tightened. Senator, my grandfather saved dozens of lives flying that aircraft. He died doing exactly what he trained to do, protecting men on the ground who had no other support. I am honored to fly an aircraft that continues his legacy. Even if it gets you killed. Yes, ma'am, some missions are worth the risk. Torres shook her head. That is very brave, Major. It is also exactly the kind of thinking that got 400 pilots killed in Vietnam flying aircraft that should never have been in combat. Elena Vasquez was called next. She testified about the technical specifications, the engineering improvements, the fundamental soundness of using a proven agricultural platform for military purposes. She was brilliant and thorough, speaking with technical precision that made perfect sense to engineers and no sense whatsoever to politicians. But near the end she paused, looked directly at Senator Torres. My father died in a plane like this, Elena said quietly. An Air Tractor 502. Simple, reliable. He was spreading fertilizer over a Texas wheat field when a fuel line failed. He crashed a mile from our house. I was 7 years old. The room quieted. I could have spent my career hating these planes, blaming them, but instead I studied them. And I learned what my father already knew. They are simple because simplicity is reliable. They are slow because slow lets you see what fast misses. They are vulnerable because vulnerability is the price of presence. She closed her folder. Sky Warden exists because I wanted to prove my father's plane was worth something, that it could save the lives it could not save that day. Senator, I understand your fear, but fear is not a strategy, and honoring our fathers means learning from them, not avoiding their mistakes. Tora's expression flickered. Something passed across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. By noon, it was clear the military was losing. Torres had the votes. She had the moral high ground built on the graves of pilots who died in slow aircraft. She had the budget argument, the strategic argument, and the emotional argument all aligned in her favor. Then Bob Harrison was called to testify. He walked to the witness table feeling every one of his 81 years. His knees protested. His back ached. The suit felt too tight around his shoulders. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at Senator Torres. She looked back with polite interest. To her, he was just another witness, another old veteran come to defend a program that nostalgia had made seem more important than it actually was. Please state your name and background for the record, Torres said. Bob cleared his throat. Robert James Harrison, born 1943, U.S. Air Force, retired. I flew F-4 Phantoms briefly in the early 1970s, then spent 20 years as an instructor pilot. In 2002, I came out of retirement to fly U-28A Draco aircraft for Special Operations Command. I flew combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq until my final retirement in 2015. Torres consulted her notes. The U-28A is also a slow aircraft, correct? Similar in concept to Sky Warden. Yes, ma'am, basically a modified civilian turboprop. And you never had concerns about the vulnerability of these aircraft? Bob paused. This was the moment. Everything that came before was preamble. Everything that came after would depend on what he said in the next few minutes. I had concerns, Senator. Serious concerns. Because 56 years ago, my brother died in an aircraft very similar to the ones we are discussing today. The room shifted. Torres leaned forward. This was not in her briefing documents. Your brother was killed in Vietnam. Yes, ma'am, June 1969. He was flying an OV-10 Bronco, forward air controller. He took ground fire, fuel tank was punctured, and he crashed in the Central Highlands. He was 28 years old. Torres' expression softened. I am very sorry for your loss, Mr. Harrison, which is precisely why I am confused about your testimony here today. You lost a brother to the same kind of aircraft you now want us to buy 75 more of. Yes, ma'am, because I spent 50 years misunderstanding what my brother's death meant. Bob took a breath. The room was completely silent now. Even the stenographers frozen in anticipation of something they sensed was coming. My brother's name was James Harrison. Everyone called him Jim. He wrote me letters from Vietnam, long letters about his missions, about the men he supported, about what it meant to fly low and slow over hostile territory. I thought he was being reckless. I thought he should have chosen a different aircraft. Something fast, something safe, something that would let him come home. His voice roughened. I was wrong. In 18 months of combat, Jim Harrison called in airstrikes that saved 43 American soldiers. 43 confirmed saves. Men who went home to their families because my brother was overhead in his slow, vulnerable crop duster when they needed him. Torres started to speak, but Bob continued. My brother got shot at 89 times, Senator. He got hit 6 times before the one that killed him. But he kept flying, kept protecting the men on the ground, because that was the mission. Not survival, not safety, but being there when Americans needed air support and no one else could provide it. He pulled a document from his jacket pocket, unfolded it carefully. The paper rattled slightly as he smoothed it flat, but his voice stayed steady. June 12, 1969. An OV-10 pilot spotted a surface-to-air missile site that a B-52's radar missed. That pilot called off a strike mission, saved the entire bomber crew from being shot down over Laos. That pilot was my brother. The B-52 pilot he saved was Captain Miguel Torres. The silence in the room became absolute. Torres had gone very still. Your father, Bob said quietly, looking directly at the senator. My brother saved your father's life 2 weeks before he died. He got a Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission. The citation is classified, which is why you never knew. But it happened, and your father survived Vietnam, came home, raised a family, because a man in a crop duster saw what the fancy radar could not. Torres' face had lost color. She opened her mouth closed, it opened it again. No words came out. Bob pressed on. For 50 years, I thought my brother was a fool for flying that plane. I thought he died because he made a bad choice, because he valued some abstract idea of service over his own survival. But I was the fool, Senator, because Jim understood something I did not. The best weapon is not the one that keeps you safest. It is the one that does the job. He gestured toward where Marcus, Jack, and Elena sat. These people are not asking you to repeat Vietnam's mistakes. They are asking you to learn from Vietnam's successes. Yes, we lost pilots in slow aircraft, but those pilots saved thousands of lives. They provided support that no fast jet could provide. They stayed overhead for hours when the F-4s and the bombers had to leave for fuel. They landed on dirt roads to evacuate wounded. They did things that billion-dollar aircraft cannot do because some missions require presence more than they require speed. Torres found her voice. Mr. Harrison, I did not know about this, about your brother and my father. I understand, ma'am. The records were classified. But now you do know, and I need you to understand what it means. Your father is alive because a crop duster pilot made a decision that the computers and the radar could not make. A human decision, a judgment call, the kind of thing that only happens when you put a trained pilot in an aircraft that can stay on station long enough to see what needs to be seen. He folded the document, put it back in his pocket. Sky Warden is not my brother's plane. It is better, safer, more capable. It has armor and countermeasures and technology Jim never dreamed of. But it has the same core philosophy. Stay overhead, protect the troops, be there when no one else can be. And yes, that means risk. Yes, pilots might die, but pilots sign up knowing the risk. What they cannot accept is being told their sacrifice does not matter, that the missions they flew were mistakes, that the men they saved did not count. Bob leaned back. He was exhausted. The words had taken every thing he had. Senator Torres, you want to honor your father's service. So do I. The way to do that is not to pretend that slow aircraft are obsolete. It is to make them as good as we possibly can, give them every advantage, and trust the pilots who fly them to make the same kinds of decisions that kept your father alive. That is what Sky Warden represents. Not nostalgia, not romanticism, but the continuation of a tradition that has saved American lives for 70 years. He stood up, wincing as his knees protested. That is all I have to say, ma'am. Thank you for your time. The room erupted, not in applause, which would have been inappropriate, but in a sudden release of tension that manifested as whispered conversations and shuffling papers, and the committee members looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to calculation to something that might have been respect. Senator Torres called a recess. 30 minutes. She left the hearing room quickly, followed by her chief of staff, and did not look at anyone as she passed. Bob made his way back to his seat in the gallery. Marcus caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that required no words. Jack and Elena both looked stunned, as though they had just witnessed something they did not quite believe had happened. The 30-minute recess stretched to an hour, then 90 minutes. The committee members returned individually, conferring in small groups, the body language of political calculation visible to anyone who knew how to read it. When Torres finally returned, her eyes were red. She had been crying, Bob realized. Crying and probably making phone calls to family, to historians, to anyone who could confirm what Bob had told her. She called the hearing back to order. Her voice was steady but different somehow, stripped of the certainty that had characterized her earlier statements. This committee will take a 1-week recess to review new information that has come to light, Torres announced. When we reconvene, we will hear additional testimony about the operational history of forward air control aircraft in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts. I have also requested that the Air Force declassify certain mission records from June 1969, which will be reviewed in executive session. She paused, looked directly at Bob. Mr. Harrison, thank you for your testimony. This committee is adjourned. The gavel came down. Politicians filed out. Reporters surged forward, trying to get statements from anyone involved. Bob ignored them all. He walked out of the Senate building into the July heat and kept walking until he found a park bench where he could sit and breathe and try to process what had just happened. Marcus found him there 20 minutes later, Jack Reeves walking beside him. The general and the pilot sat down without asking permission, and for a while all three sat in silence. 3 generations of men connected by crop dusters, watching tourists photograph monuments to wars that never involved planes like the ones they flew. That was the bravest thing I have ever seen, Marcus said finally. Bob shook his head. It was just the truth. Should have told it 50 years ago. Would anyone have listened 50 years ago? Probably not. They sat some more. Pigeons pecked at the ground near their feet. Somewhere in the distance, a tour guide explained the significance of a building that probably did not deserve the significance attributed to it. Jack spoke for the first time since sitting down. My grandfather would have done what you did today, Mr. Harrison. Stood up, told the truth. Even when it hurt. Bob looked at the younger pilot, saw Tom Reeves in the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his gaze. Your grandfather did not get the chance to defend what he believed in. I am doing this for him too. Then we go to Africa together, Jack said. All of us. And we prove they were right. All of them. What happens now? Bob asked. Now we wait for Torres to decide if she believes her father's life was worth a crop duster pilot's sacrifice, Marcus said. If she does, we get our program. If she does not, Sky Warden dies and we start over with something else. And if the program dies, then Jim's legacy dies with it. And every lesson we learned from Vietnam, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, about the value of presence over speed gets forgotten for another generation. Bob considered this. No pressure then? Marcus laughed, brief and sharp. No pressure at all. Just the future of American air support for the next 50 years, riding on whether one senator can admit her worldview might be incomplete. They sat for another few minutes, then Marcus stood. We deploy in 3 weeks regardless of what Congress decides. Sky Warden is going to Africa for operational testing. The question is whether we will have support or be doing it as a rogue operation that ends everyone's career. I am still coming, Bob said. I know. Elena already put you on the manifest as a technical observer. The lawyers are not happy about it, but they also cannot find any regulation that specifically prohibits 81-year-old retirees from deploying to combat zones. Bob stood joints protesting. Where exactly are we deploying? Djibouti initially, Camp Lemonnier, then missions across 5 countries, Somalia, Mali, Niger, Kenya, Chad, supporting counterterrorism operations, protecting civilians, doing all the things that crop dusters are supposedly too obsolete to do. And if we succeed, we prove Torres wrong and save the program. If we fail, people die and she was right all along. They walked back toward the Senate building where Marcus had a car waiting. The July sun beat down with casual cruelty. Tourists took selfies. Government workers hurried to lunch meetings. The city continued its daily business, indifferent to the small drama playing out in hearing rooms and old men's memories. Bob Harrison thought about Africa. about deploying at 81 to a continent he had never visited to support missions he could barely imagine. He thought about Jim, who deployed at 26 to a war he did not survive. He thought about all the pilots in between, the ones who flew slow and low and came home, and the ones who did not. And he thought about Sky Warden, that ungainly crop duster waiting on a Florida tarmac, carrying the hopes of men long dead and the futures of men not yet born. 3 weeks. Then he would find out if his brother's death meant something, or if it was just one more tragedy in a long history of tragedies that added up to nothing in particular. The car pulled away from the curb. Through the window, Bob watched Washington slide past all marble and monuments and the careful cultivation of significance. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Senator Catherine Torres was learning that her father survived because of the exact kind of pilot she had spent her career trying to eliminate from the military. History was smaller than people wanted to believe, more connected, more personal. The decisions made in 1969, echoing into 2024, shaping budgets and programs, and the futures of aircraft that had not yet been built when Jim Harrison died over the Central Highlands. Bob closed his eyes and let the air conditioning wash over him. 3 weeks, then Africa, then whatever came next. What Bob did not know, sitting in that car as Washington disappeared behind him, was that 3 weeks from now, he would make a decision that would save 3,000 lives and prove his brother right in ways he could never have imagined. He did not know that Senator Torres would spend those 3 weeks reading every classified document about her father's service, and that what she found would change everything. He did not know that in Africa, the simple crop duster would do what no billion-dollar stealth fighter could do, that it would hover over a refugee camp for 8 hours, burning less fuel than a sports car on a road trip, and change the course of a war nobody was watching. He did not know about the reunion waiting for him, about the letter written 55 years ago by a man named Tom Reeves that would finally, after all this time, give Bob permission to forgive himself, about the moment when 3,000 people whose names he would never know would owe their lives to a decision he had not yet made. But that story is for what comes next. For now, Bob Harrison had made his peace with testifying, with telling the truth, with honoring Jim's memory by defending the legacy of every pilot who chose the slow plane in the hard mission. 3 weeks until deployment. 3 weeks until everything changed. 3 weeks until Bob Harrison learned that some debts can only be repaid by flying toward them. He was 81 years old and heading to war. Jim would have understood.